Chapter 25 of the Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. It was clear to Sara Lee from the beginning of the evening that Harvey did not intend to hear her story. He did not say so. Indeed, for a time he did not talk at all. He sat with his arms round her, content to just have her there. "I have a lot of arrears to make up," he said. "I've got to get used to having you where I can touch you. Tonight, when I go upstairs, I'm going to take that damned colorless photograph of you and throw it out the window." "I must tell you about your photograph," she ventured. "It always stood on the mantel over the stove, and when there was a threatened bombardment I used to put it under—" "Let's not talk, honey." When he came out of that particular silence he said abruptly, "Will Leete is dead." "Oh no. Poor Will Leete." "Died of pneumonia in some godforsaken hole over there. He left a wife and nothing much to keep her. That's what comes of mixing in the other fellow's fight. I guess we can get the house as soon as we want it. She has to sell, and it ought to be a bargain." "Harvey," she said rather timidly, "you speak of the other fellow's fight. They say over there that we are sure to be drawn into it sooner or later." "Not on our life," he replied brusquely. "And if you don't mind, honey, I don't care to hear about what they think over there." He got up from his old place on the arm of her chair and stood on the rug. "I'd better tell you now how I feel about this thing. I can't talk about it, that's all. We'll finish up now and let it go at that. I'm sorry there's a war. I'll send money when I can afford it, to help the Belgians, although my personal opinion is that they're getting theirs for what they did in the Congo. But I don't want to hear about what you did over there." He saw her face, and he went to her and kissed her cheek. "I don't want to hurt you, honey," he said. "I love you with all my heart, but somehow I can't forget that you left me and went over there when there was no reason for it. You put off our marriage, and I suppose we'd better get over it. Go ahead and tell me about it." He drew up a chair and waited, but the girl smiled rather tremulously. "Perhaps we'd better wait, if you feel that way, Harvey." His face was set as he looked at her. "There's only one thing I want to know," he said, "and I've got a right to know that. You're a young girl, and you're beautiful. To me, anyhow. You've been over there with a lot of crazy foreigners." He got up again, and all the bitterness of the empty months was in his voice. "Did any of them? Was there anybody there that you cared about?" "I came back, Harvey." "That's not the question." "There were many men, officers, who were kind to me. "That's not the question either." "If I had loved anyone more than I love you I should not have come back." "Wait a minute," he said quickly. "You had to come back, you know." "I could have stayed. The English woman who took over my work asked me to stay on and help her." He was satisfied then. He went back to the arm of her chair and kissed her. "All right," he said. "I've suffered the tortures of the damned, but that fixes it. Now let's talk about something else. I'm sick of this war talk." "I'd like to tell you about my little house, and poor René." "Who is René?" he demanded. "The orderly." "The one on the step, with the rifle?" "Yes." "Look here," he said. "I've got to get all that gradually. I don't know that I'll ever get to it cheerfully. But I can't talk about that place tonight. And I don't want to talk war. The whole business makes me sick. I've got a car out of it, and if things keep on we may be able to get the Leete house. But there's no reason in it, no sense. I'm sick to death of hearing about it. Let's talk of something else." But, and here was something strange, Sara Lee could find nothing else to talk about. The thing that she had looked forward so eagerly to telling, that was barred, and the small gossip of their little circle, purely personal and trivial, held only faint interest for her. For the first time they had no common ground to meet on. Yet it was a very happy man who went whistling to his room that night. He was rather proud of himself, too. After all the bitterness of the past months, he had been gentle and loving to Sara Lee. He had not scolded her. In the next room he could hear her going quietly about, opening and closing the drawers of the new bureau, moving a chair. Pretty soon, God willing, they need never be separated. He would have her always, to protect and cherish and love. He went outside to her closed door. "Good night, sweetheart," he called softly. "Good night, dear," came her soft reply. But long after he was asleep Sara Lee stood at her window and listened to the leaves, so like the feet of weary men on the ruined street over there. For the first time she was questioning the very thing she had done. She loved Harvey, but there were many kinds of love. There was the love of Jean for Henri. And there was the wonderful love, though the memory now was cruel and hurt her, of Henri for herself. And there was the love of Marie for the memory of Maurice, the spy. Many kinds of love, and one heart might love many people, in different ways. A small doubt crept into her mind. This feeling she had for Harvey was not what she had thought it was over there. It was a thing that had belonged to a certain phase of her life. But that phase was over. It was, like Marie's, but a memory. This Harvey of the new car and the increased income and the occasional hardness in his voice was not the Harvey she had left. Or perhaps it was she who had changed. She wondered. She felt precisely the same, tender toward her friends, unwilling to hurt them. She did not want to hurt Harvey. But she did not love him as he deserved to be loved. And she had a momentary lift of the veil when she saw the long vista of the years, the two of them always together and always between them hidden, untouched, but eating like a cancer, Harvey's resentment and suspicion of her months away from him. There would always be a barrier between them, not only on Harvey's side. There were things she had no right to tell, of Henri, of his love and care for her, and of that last terrible day when he realized what he had done. That night, lying in the new bed, she faced that situation too. How much was she to blame? If Henri felt that each life lost was lost by him, wasn't the same true for her? Why had she allowed him to stay in London? But that was one question she did not answer frankly. She lay there in the darkness and wondered what punishment he would receive. He had done so much for them over there. Surely they would allow for that. But small things came back to her. The awful sight of the miller and his son, led away to death, with the sacks over their heads. The relentlessness of it all. The expecting that men should give everything, even life itself, and ask for no mercy. And this too she remembered. Once in a wild moment Henri had said that he would follow her to America, and that there he would prove to her that his and not Harvey's was the real love of her life. The great love that comes but once to any woman, and to some not at all. Yet on that last night at Morley's he had said what she now felt was a final farewell. That last look of his, from the doorway, that had been the look of a man who would fill his eyes for the last time. She got up and stood by the window. What had they done to him? What would they do? She looked at her watch. It was 4 o'clock in the morning over there. The little house would be quiet now, but down along the lines men would be standing on the firing strip of the trench and waiting, against what the dawn might bring. Through the thin wall came the sound of Harvey's heavy, regular breathing. She remembered Henri's light sleeping on the kitchen floor, his cap on the table, his cape rolled round him, sleeping, for all his weariness, so light that he always seemed half conscious. She remembered the innumerable times he had come in at this hour, muddy, sometimes rather gray of face with fatigue, but always cheerful. It was just such an hour that she found him giving hot coffee to the German prisoner. It had been but a little earlier when he had taken her to the roof and had there shown her Rene, lying with his face up toward the sky which had sent him death. 100 memories crowded, Henri's love for the Belgian soldiers and theirs for him, his humor, his absurd riddles. There was the one he had asked Rene, the very day before the air attack. He had stood stiffly and frowningly before the boy, and he had asked him in a highly official tone, "What must a man be to be buried with military honors?" "A general?" "No." "An officer?" "No, no. Use your head, boy. This is very important. A mistake would be most serious." Rene had shaken his head dejectedly. "He must be dead, Rene," Henri had said gravely. "Entirely dead. As I said, it is well to know these things. A mistake would be unfortunate." His blue eyes had gleamed with fun, but his face had remained frowning. It was quite 5 minutes before she had heard Rene chuckling on the doorstep. Was he still living, this Henri of the love of life and courting of death? Could anything so living die? And if he had died, had it been because of her? She faced that squarely for the first time. "Perhaps even beyond the stars they have need of a little house of mercy. And, God knows, wherever I am, I shall have need of you." Beyond the partition Harvey slept on, his arms under his head. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Harvey was clamoring for an early wedding, and indeed there were very few arguments against it, save one that Sara Lee buried in her heart. Belle's house was small, and though she was welcome there, and more than that, Sara Lee knew that she was crowding the family. Perhaps Sara Lee would have agreed in the end. There seemed to be nothing else to do, though by the end of the first week she was no longer in any doubt as to what her feeling for Harvey really was. It was kindness, affection, but it was not love. She would marry him because she had promised to, and because their small world expected her to do so, and because she could not shame him again. For, to her surprise, she found that that was what he had felt, a strange, self-conscious shame, like that of a man who has been jilted. She felt that by coming back to him she had forfeited the right to break the engagement. So every hour of every day seemed to make the thing more inevitable. Belle was embroidering towels for her in her scant leisure. Even Anna, with a second child coming, sent in her contribution to the bride's linen chest. But almost desperately insisting on a visit to Aunt Harriet, she got a reprieve of a month, and Harvey was inclined to be jealous even of that. Sometimes, but mostly at night when she was alone, a hot wave of resentment overwhelmed her. Why should she be forced into the thing? Was there any prospect of happiness after marriage when there was so little before? For she realized now that even Harvey was not happy. He had at last definitely refused to hear the story of the little house. "I'd just rather forget it, honey," he said. But inconsistently he knew she did not forget it, and it angered him. True to his insistence on ignoring those months of her absence, she made no attempt to tell him. Now and then, however, closed in the library together, they would fail of things to talk about, and Sara Lee's knitting needles would be the only sound in the room. At those times he would sit back in his chair and watch the faraway look in her eyes, and it maddened him. From her busy life Belle studied them both, with an understanding she did not reveal. And one morning when the mail came she saw Sara Lee's face as she turned away, finding there was no letter for her, and made an excuse to follow her to her room. The girl was standing by the window looking out. The children were playing below, and the maple trees were silent. Belle joined her there and slipped an arm round her. "Why are you doing it, Sara Lee?" she asked. "Doing what?" "Marrying Harvey." Sara Lee looked at her with startled eyes. "I'm engaged to him, Belle. I've promised." "Exactly," said Belle dryly. "But that's hardly a good reason, is it? It takes more than a promise." She stared down at the flock of children in the yard below. "Harvey's a man," she said. "He doesn't understand. But I do. You've got to care a whole lot, Sara Lee, if you're going to go through with it. It takes a lot of love, when it comes to having children and all that." "He's so good, Belle. How can I hurt him?" "You'll hurt him a whole lot more by marrying him when you don't love him." "If only I could have a little time," she cried wildly. I'm tired, Belle. And I can't forget about the war and all that. I've tried. Sometimes I think if we could talk it over together I'd get it out of my mind." "He won't talk about it?" "No." "He's my own brother, and I love him dearly. But sometimes I think he's hard. Not that he's ever ugly," she hastened to add, "but he's stubborn. There's a sort of wall in him, and he puts some things behind it, and it's like beating against a rock to try and get at them." After a little silence she said hesitatingly, "We've got him to think of, too. He has a right to be happy. Sometimes I've looked at you. You're so pretty, Sara Lee. And I've wondered if there wasn't someone over there who cared for you." "There was one man, an officer. Oh, Belle, I can't tell you. Not you." "Why not?" asked Belle practically. "You ought to talk it out with someone, and if Harvey insists on being a fool that's his own fault." For all the remainder of that sunny morning Sara Lee talked what was in her heart, and Belle, poor, romantic, starved Belle, heard and thrilled. She made buttonholes as she listened, but once or twice a new tone in Sara Lee's voice caused her to look up. Here was a new Sara Lee, a creature of vibrant voice and glowing eyes, and Belle was not stupid. She saw that it was Henri whose name brought the deeper note. Sara Lee had stopped with her recall, had stopped and looked about the room with its shiny new furniture, and had shivered. Belle bent over her work. "Why don't you go back?" she asked. Sara Lee looked at her piteously. "How can I? There's Harvey, and the society would not send me again. It's over, Belle. All over." After a pause Belle said, "What's become of Henri? He hasn't written, has he?" Sara Lee got up and went to the window. "I don't know where he is. He may be dead." Her voice was flat and lifeless. Belle knew all that she wanted to know. She rose and gathered up her sewing. "I'm going to talk to Harvey. You're not going to be rushed into a wedding. You're tired, and it's all nonsense. Well, I'll have to run now and dress the children." That night Harvey and Belle had almost a violent scene. He had taken Sara Lee over to the Leete house that evening. Will Leete's widow had met them there, a small sad figure in her mourning, but very composed, until she opened the door into a tiny room upstairs with a desk and a lamp in it. "This was Will's study," she said. "He did his work here in the evenings, and I sat in that little chair and sewed. I never thought then—" her lips quivered. "Pretty rotten of Will Leete to leave that little thing alone," said Harvey on their way home. "He had his fling, and she's paying for it." But Sara Lee was silent. It was useless to try to make Harvey understand the urge that had called Will Leete across the sea to do his share for the war, and that had brought him that peace of God that passeth all understanding. It was not a good time for Belle to put up to him her suggestion for a delay in the marriage, that evening after their return. He took it badly and insisted on sending upstairs for Sara Lee. "Did you ask Belle to do this?" he demanded bluntly. "To do what?" "To put the thing off." "I have already told you, Harvey," Belle put in. "It is my own idea. She is tired. She's been through a lot. I've heard the story you're too stubborn to listen to, and I strongly advise her to wait a while." And, after a time, he agreed ungraciously. He would buy the house and fix it over, and in the early fall it would be ready. "Unless," he added to Sara Lee with a bitterness born of disappointment, "unless you change your mind again." He did not kiss her that night when she and Belle went together up the stairs, but he stared after her gloomily, with hurt and bewilderment in his eyes. He did not understand. He never would. She had come home to him all gentleness and tenderness, ready to find in him the thing she needed so badly. But out of his obstinacy and hurt he had himself built up a barrier. That night Sara Lee dreamed that she was back in the little house of mercy. René was there, and Henri, and Jean with the patch over his eye. They were waiting for the men to come, and the narrow hall was full of the odor of Marie's soup. Then she heard them coming, the shuffling of many feet on the road. She went to the door, with Henri beside her, and watched them coming up the road, a deeper shadow in the blackness. Tired men, wounded men, homeless men, coming to her little house with its firelight and its warmth. Here and there the match that lighted a cigarette showed a white but smiling face. They stopped before the door, and the warm little house, with its guarded lights and its food and cheer, took them in. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. A very pale and desperate Henri took the night train for Folkestone after he had said good-bye to Sara Lee. He alternately chilled and burned with fever, and when he slept, as he did now and then, going off suddenly into a doze and waking with a jerk, it was to dream of horrors. He thought, in his wilder intervals, of killing himself, but his code did not include such a shirker's refuge. He was going back to tell his story and to take his punishment. He had cabled to Jean to meet him at Calais, but when, at dawn the next morning, the Channel boat drew in to the wharf there was no sign of Jean or the car. Henri regarded the empty quay with apathetic eyes. They would come, later on. If only he could get his head down and sleep for a while he would be better able to get toward the front. For he knew now that he was ill. He had, indeed, been ill for days, but he did not realize that. And he hated illness. He regarded it with suspicion, as a weakness not for a strong man. The drowsy girl in her chair at the Gare Maritime regarded him curiously and with interest. Many women turned to look after Henri, but he did not know this. Had he known it, he would have regarded it much as he did illness. The stupid boy was not round. The girl herself took the key and led the way down the long corridor upstairs to a room. Henri stumbled in and fell across the bed. He was almost immediately asleep. Late in the afternoon he wakened. Strange that Jean had not come. He got up and bathed his face. His right arm was very stiff now, and pains ran from the old wound in his chest down to the fingers of his hand. He tried to exercise to limber it, and grew almost weak with pain. At 6 o'clock, when Jean had not come, Henri resorted to ways that he knew of and secured a car. He had had some coffee by that time, and he felt much better. So well, indeed, that he sang under his breath a strange rambling sound that sounded rather like René's rendering of Tipperary. The driver looked at him curiously every now and then. It was 10 o'clock when they reached La Panne. Henri went at once to the villa set high on a sand dune where the King's secretary lived. The house was dark, but in the library at the rear there was a light. He stumbled along the paths beside the house and reached at last, after interminable miles, when the path sometimes came up almost to his eyes and again fell away so that it seemed to drop from under his feet. At last he reached the long French doors, with their drawn curtains. He opened the door suddenly and thereby surprised the secretary, who was a most dignified and rather nervous gentleman, into laying his hand on a heavy inkwell. "I wish to see the King," said Henri in a loud tone. Because at that moment the secretary, lamp and inkwell and all, retired suddenly to a very great distance, as if one had viewed them through the reverse end of an opera glass. The secretary knew Henri. He, too, eyed him curiously. "The King has retired, monsieur." "I think," said Henri in a dangerous tone, "that he will see me." To tell the truth, the secretary rather thought so too. There was a strange rumor going round, to the effect that the boy had followed a woman to England at a critical time, which would have been a pity, the secretary thought. There were so many women, and so few men like Henri. The secretary considered it gravely. Henri was by that time in a chair, but it moved about so that he had to hold very tight to the arms. When he looked up again the secretary had picked up his soft black hat and was at the door. "I shall inquire," he said. Henri saluted him stiffly with his left hand as he went out. The secretary went to His Majesty's equerry, who was in the next house playing solitaire and trying to forget the family he had left on the other side of the line. So it was that in due time Henri again traversed miles of path and pavement, between tall borders of wild sea grass, miles which perhaps were 100 yards, and went round the screen and found the King on the hearthrug. But when he drew himself stiffly to attention he overdid the thing rather, and went over backwards with a crash. He was up again almost immediately, very flushed and uncomfortable. After that he kept himself in hand, but the King, who had a way all his own of forgetting his divine right to rule, and a great many other things, the King watched him gravely. Henri sat in a chair and made a clean breast of it. Because he was feeling rather strange he told a great many things that an agent of the Secret Service is hardly expected to reveal to his king. He mentioned, for instance, the color of Sara Lee's eyes, and the way she bandaged, like one who had been trained. Once, in the very middle of his narrative, where he had put the letter from the front in his pocket and decided to go to England anyhow, he stopped and hummed René's version of Tipperary. Only a bar or two. Then he remembered. But one thing brought him round with a start. "Then," the King said slowly, "Jean was not with you?" Only he did not call him Jean. He gave him his other name which, like Henri's, is not to be told. Henri's brain cleared then with the news that Jean was missing. When, somewhat later, he staggered out of the villa, it was under royal instruction to report to the great hospital along the sea front and near by, and there to go to bed and have a doctor. Indeed, because the boy's eyes were wild by that time, the equerry went along and held his arm. But that was because Henri was in open revolt, and while walking steadily enough showed a tendency to bolt every now and then. He would stop on the way and argue, though one does not argue easily with an equerry. "I must go," he would say fretfully. "God knows where he is. He'd never give me up if I were the one." And once he shook off the equerry violently and said, "Let go of me, I tell you. I'll come back and go to bed when I've found him." The equerry soothed him like a child. An English nurse took charge of Henri in the hospital and put him to bed. He was very polite to her and extremely cynical. She sat in a chair by his bed and held the key of the room in her hand. Once he thought that she was Sara Lee, but that was only for a moment. She did not look like Sara Lee. And she was suspicious, too, for when he asked her what she could put in her left hand that she could not put in her right, she moved away and placed the door key on the stand, out of reach. However, toward morning she dozed. There was steady firing at Nieuport, and the windows shook constantly. An ambulance came in, followed by a stirring on the lower floor. Then silence. He got up then and secured the key. There was no time for dressing, because she was a suspicious person and likely to waken at any time. He rolled his clothing into a bundle and carried it under his well arm. The other was almost useless. The ambulance was still waiting outside, at the foot of the staircase. There were voices and lights in the operating room, forward along the tiled hall. Still in his night clothing, Henri got into the ambulance and threw his uniform behind him. Then he got the car under way. Outside the village he paused long enough to dress. His head was amazingly clear. He had never felt so sure of himself before. As to his errand he had no doubt whatever. Jean had learned that he had crossed the Channel. Therefore Jean had taken up his work. Jean, who had but one eye and was as clumsy as a bear. The thought of Jean crawling through the German trenches set him laughing until he ended with a sob. It was rather odd about the ambulance. It did not keep the road very well. Sometimes it was on one side and sometimes on the other. It slid as though the road were greased. After a time Henri made an amazing discovery. He was not alone in the car. He looked back, without stopping, and the machine went off in a wide arc. He brought it back again, grinning. "Thought you had me, didn't you?" he observed to the car in general, and the engine in particular. "Now, no tricks!" There was a wounded man in the car. He had had morphia, and he was very comfortable. He was not badly hurt, and he considered that he was being taken to Calais. He was too tired to talk, and the swinging of the car rather interested him. He would doze and waken and doze again. But at last he heard something that made him rise on his elbow. It was the hammering of the big guns. He called Henri's attention to this, but Henri said, "Lie down, Jean, and don't talk. We'll make it yet." The wounded man intended to protest, but he went to sleep instead. They had reached the village now, where was the little house of mercy. The ambulance rolled and leaped down the street, with both lights full on, which was forbidden, and came to a stop at the door. The man inside was grunting then, and Henri, whose head had never been so clear, got out and went round to the rear of the car. "Now, out with you, comrade," he said. "I have made an error, but it is immaterial. Can you walk?" He lighted a cigarette and the man inside saw his burning eyes and shaking hands. Even through the apathy of the morphia he felt a thrill of terror. He could walk. He got out while Henri pounded at the door. "Attention!" he called. "Attention!" Then he hummed an air of the camps. Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas. When he heard steps inside, Henri went back to the ambulance. He got in and drove it, lights and all, down the street. Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas. Somewhere down the road, beyond the poplar trees, he abandoned the ambulance. They found it there the next morning, or rather what was left of it. Evidently its two unwinking eyes had got on the Germans' nerves. Early the next morning a Saxon regiment, standing on the firing step ready for what the dawn might bring forth, watched the mist rise from the water in front of them. It shone on the body of a Belgian in uniform lying across their wire, and very close indeed. Now, the Saxons are not Prussians, so no one for good sport fired at the body, which was rather a good thing, because it moved slightly and stirred. And then in a loud voice, which is an unusual thing for bodies to possess, it began to sing, Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Late in August, Sara Lee broke her engagement with Harvey. She had been away, at Cousin Jennie's, for a month, and for the first time since her return she had had time to think. In the little suburban town there were long hours of quiet when Cousin Jennie mended on the porch and Aunt Harriet, enjoying a sort of reflected glory from Sara Lee, presided at Red Cross meetings. Sara Lee decided to send for Harvey, and he came for a weekend, arriving pathetically eager, but with a sort of defiance, too. He was determined to hold her, but to hold her on his own terms. Aunt Harriet had been vaguely uneasy, but Harvey's arrival seemed to put everything right. She even kissed him when he came, and took great pains to carry off Cousin Jennie when she showed an inclination toward conversation and a seat on the porch. Sara Lee had made a desperate resolve. She intended to lay all her cards on the table. He should know all that there was to know. If after that he still wanted to hold her, but she did not go so far. She was so sure he would release her. It was a despairing thing to do, but she was rather despairing those days. There had been no letter from Henri or from Jean. She had written them both several times, at Dunkirk, to the Savoy in London, to the little house near the front, but no replies had come. Yet mail was going through. Mabel Andrews' letters from Boulogne came regularly. When August went by with no letters save Harvey's begging her to come back, she gave up at last. In the little church on Sundays, with Jennie on the one side and Aunt Harriet on the other, she voiced small silent prayers, that the thing she feared had not happened. But she could not think of Henri as not living. He was too strong, too vital. She did not understand herself those days. She was desperately unhappy. Sometimes she wondered if it would not be easier to know the truth, even if that truth comprehended the worst. Once she received, from some unknown hand, a French journal, and pored over it for days with her French dictionary, to find out if it contained any news. It was not until a week later that she received a letter from Mabel, explaining that she had sent the journal, which contained a description of her hospital. All of Harvey's Sunday she spent in trying to bring her courage to the point of breaking the silence he had imposed on her, but it was not until evening that she succeeded. The house was empty. The family had gone to church. On the veranda, with the heavy scent of phlox at night permeating the still air, Sara Lee made her confession. She began at the beginning. Harvey did not stir, until she told of the way she had stowed away to cross the Channel. Then he moved. "This fellow who planned that out for you, did you ever see him again?" "He met me in Calais." "And then what?" "He took me to Dunkirk in his car. Such a hideous car, Harvey. All wrecked. It had been under fire again and again. "He took you to Dunkirk? Who was with you?" "Just Jean, the chauffeur." "I like his nerve. Wasn't there in all that God-forsaken country a woman to take with you? You and this what was his name, anyhow?" "I can't tell you that, Harvey."
"Look here!" he burst out. "How much of this aren't you going to tell? Because I want it all or not at all."
"I can't tell you his name. I'm only trying to make you understand the way I feel about things. His name doesn't matter." She clenched her hands in the darkness. "I don't think he's alive now." He tried to see her face, but she turned it away.
"Dead, eh? What makes you think that?"
"I haven't heard from him."
"Why should you hear from him?" His voice cut out like a knife. "Look at me. Why should he write to you?"
"He cared for me, Harvey." He sat in a heavy silence which alarmed her. "Don't be angry, please," she begged. "I couldn't bear it. It wasn't my fault, or his either."
"The damned scoundrel,"
said Harvey thickly. But she reached over and put a trembling hand over his lips. "Don't say that," she said. "Don't. I won't allow you to. When I think of what might have happened to him, Her voice broke.
"Go on,"
Harvey said in cold tones she had never heard before.
"Tell it all now. Now you've begun it. God knows I didn't want to hear it. He took you to the hotel at Dunkirk, the way those foreigners take their women, and he established you in the house at the front, I suppose, like a—"
Sara Lee suddenly stood up and drew off her ring. "You needn't go on," she said quietly. "I had a decision to make tonight, and I have made it. Ever since I came home I have been trying to go back to where I was before I left. It is impossible. You are what you always were, Harvey, but I've changed. I can't go back." She put the ring into his hand. "It isn't that you don't love me. I think you do. But I've been thinking things over. It isn't only tonight, or what you just said. It's because we don't care for the same things, or believe in them."
"But if we love each other—"
"It's not that either. I used to feel that way. A home, and someone to care about, and a little pleasure, and work."
"That ought to be enough, honey."
He was terrified. His anger was gone. He placed an appealing hand on her arm, and as she stood there in the faint starlight, the wonder of her once again got him by the throat. She had that sort of repressed eagerness, that look of being poised for flight, that had always made him feel cheap and unworthy.
"Isn't that enough, honey?"
he repeated. "Not now," she said, her eyes turned toward the east. "These are great days, Harvey. They are greater and more terrible than any one can know who has not been there. I've been there, and I know. I haven't the right to all this peace and comfort when I know how things are going over there." Down the quiet street of the little town service was over. The last hymn had been sung. Through the open windows came the mellow sound of the minister's voice in benediction, too far away to be more than a tone, like a single deep note of the organ. Sara Lee listened. She knew the words he was saying, and she listened with her eyes turned to the east. "The peace of God that passeth all understanding be and abide with you all, forevermore. Amen." Sara Lee listened, and from the step below her Harvey watched her with furtive, haggard eyes. He had not heard the benediction. "The peace of God," she said slowly. "There's only one peace of God, Harvey, and that is service. I'm going back."
"Service!" he scoffed. "You are going back to him."
"I'm afraid he's not there any more. I'm going back to work. But if he is there—"
Harvey slid the ring into his pocket. "What if he's not there?" he demanded bitterly. "If you think, after all this, that I'm going to wait, on the chance of your coming back to me, you're mistaken. I've been a laughingstock long enough."
In the light of her new decision Sara Lee viewed him for the first time with the pitiless eyes of women who have lost a faith. She saw him for what he was, not deliberately cruel, not even unkindly, but selfish, small, without vision. Harvey was for his own fireside, his office, his little family group. His labor would always be for himself and his own. Whereas Sara Lee was, now and forever, for all the world, her hands consecrated to bind up its little wounds and to soothe its great ones. Harvey craved a cheap and easy peace. She wanted no peace except that brought by service, the peace of a tired body, the peace of the little house in Belgium where, after days of torture, weary men found quiet and ease and the cheer of the open door. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Late in October, Sara Lee went back to the little house of mercy. Went unaccredited and with her own money. She had sold a bit of her property. In London she went to the Traverses, as before. But with a difference, too. For Sara Lee had learned the strangeness of the English, who are slow to friendships, but who never forget. Indeed, a telegram met her at Liverpool, asking her to stop with them in London. She replied, refusing but thanking them, and saying she would call the next afternoon. Everything was the same at Morley's. Rather a larger percentage of men in uniform, perhaps, greater crowds in the square, a little less of the optimism which in the spring had predicted victory before autumn, but the same high courage, for all that. August greeted her like an old friend. Even the waiters bowed to her, and upstairs the elderly chambermaid fussed over her like a mother. "And you're going back!" she exclaimed. "Fancy that now! You are brave, miss." But her keen eyes saw a change in Sara Lee. Her smile was the same, but there were times when she forgot to finish a sentence, and stood, that first morning, for an hour by the window, looking out as if she saw nothing. She went, before the visit to the Traverses, to the church of St. Martin in the Fields. It was empty, save for a woman in the corner, who did not kneel, but sat staring quietly before her. Sara Lee prayed an inarticulate bit of a prayer, that what the Traverses would have to tell her should not be the thing that she feared, but that, if it were, she would be given courage to meet it and to go on with her work. The Traverses would know. Mrs. Cameron was a friend. They would know about Henri and about Jean. Soon, within the hour, she would learn everything. So she asked for strength, and then sat there for a time, letting the peace of the old church quiet her, as had the broken walls and shattered altar of that other church across the Channel. It was rather a surprise to Sara Lee to have Mrs. Travers put her arms about her and kiss her. Mr. Travers, too, patted her hand when he took it. But they had, for all that, the reserve of their class. Much that they felt about Sara Lee they did not express even to each other. "We are so grateful to you," Mrs. Travers said. "I am only one mother, and of course now—" She looked down at her black dress. "But how many mothers there are who will want to thank you, when this terrible thing is over, and they learn about you." Mr. Travers had been eyeing Sara Lee. "Didn't use you up, did it?" he asked. "You're not looking quite fit." Sara Lee was very pale just then. In a moment she would know. "I am quite well," she said. Do you hear from Mrs. Cameron?" "Frequently. She has worked hard, but she is not young." It was Mrs. Travers who spoke. "She's afraid of the winter there. I rather think, since you want to go back, that she will be glad to turn your domain over to you for a time." "Then the little house is still there?" "Indeed, yes. A very famous little house indeed. But it is always known as your house. She has felt like a temporary chatelaine. She always thought you would come back." Tea had come, as before. The momentary stir gave her a chance to brace herself. Mr. Travers brought her cup to her and smiled gently down at her. "We have a plan to talk over," he said, "when you have had your tea. I hope you will agree to it." He went back to the hearthrug. "When I was there before," Sara Lee said, trying to hold her cup steady, "there was a young Belgian officer who was very kind to me. Indeed, all the credit for what I did belongs to him. And since I went home, I haven't heard—" Her voice broke suddenly. Mr. Travers glanced at his wife. Not for nothing had Mrs. Cameron written her long letters to these old friends, in the quiet summer afternoons when the sun shone down on the lifeless street before the little house. "I'm afraid we have bad news for you." Mrs. Travers put down her untasted tea. "Or rather, we have no news. Of course," she added, seeing Sara Lee's eyes, "in this war no news may be the best. That is, he may be a prisoner." "That," Sara Lee heard herself say, "is impossible. If they captured him they would shoot him." Mrs. Travers nodded silently. They knew Henri's business, too, by that time, and that there was no hope for a captured spy. "And Jean?" They did not know of Jean, so she told them, still in that faraway voice. And at last Mrs. Travers brought an early letter of Mrs. Cameron's and read a part of it aloud. "He seems to have been delirious," she said, holding her reading glasses to her eyes. "A friend of his, very devoted to him, was missing, and he learned this somehow. He escaped from the hospital and got away in an ambulance. He came straight here and wakened us. There had been a wounded man in the machine, and he left him on our doorstep. When I got to the door the car was going wildly toward the front, with both lamps lighted. We did not understand then, of course, and no one thought of following it. The ambulance was found smashed by a shell the next morning, and at first we thought that he had been in it. But there was no sign that he had been. And that night one of the men from the trenches insisted that he had climbed out of a firing trench where the soldiers stood, and had gone forward, bareheaded, toward the German lines. I'm afraid it was the end. The men, however, who all loved him, do not think so. It seems that he has done miracles again and again. I understand that along the whole Belgian line they watch for him at night. The other night a German on reconnaissance got very close to our wire, and was greeted not by shouts, but by a wild hurrah. He was almost paralyzed with surprise. They brought him here on the way back to the prison camp, and he still looked dazed." Sara Lee sat with her hands clenched. Mrs. Travers folded the letter and put it back into its envelope. "How long ago was that?" Sara Lee asked in a low tone. "Because, if he was coming back at all—" "4 months." Suddenly Sara Lee stood up. "I think I ought to tell you," she said with a dead white face, "that I am responsible. He cared for me, and I was in love with him, too." only I didn't know it then. I let him bring me to England because I suppose it was because I loved him. I didn't think then that it was that. I was engaged to a man at home." "Sit down," said Mr. Travers. "My dear child, nothing can be your fault." "He came with me, and the Germans got through. He had had word, but—" "Have you your salts?" Mr. Travers asked quietly to his wife. "I'm not fainting. I'm only utterly wretched." The Traverses looked at each other. They were English. They had taken their own great loss quietly, because it was an individual grief and must not be intruded on the sorrow of a nation. But they found this white-faced girl infinitely appealing, a small and fragile figure, to whose grief must be added, without any fault of hers, a bitter and lasting remorse. Sara Lee stood up and tried to smile. "Please don't worry about me," she said. "I need something to do, that's all. You see, I've been worrying for so long. If I can get to work and try to make up I'll not be so hopeless. But I am not quite hopeless, either," she added hastily. It was as though by the very word she had consigned Henri to death. "You see, I am like the men. I won't give him up. And perhaps some night he will come across from the other side, out of the dark." Mr. Travers took her back to the hotel. When he returned from paying off the taxi he found her looking across the square. "Do you remember," she asked him, "the time when the little donkey was hurt over there?" "I shall never forget it." "And the young officer who ran out when I did, and shot the poor thing?" Mr. Travers remembered. "That was he, the man we have been speaking of." For the first time that day her eyes filled with tears. Sara Lee, at 20, was already living in her memories. So again the lights went down in front, and the backdrop became a veil and invisible. And to Sara Lee there came back again some of the characters of the early mise en scène: marching men, forage wagons, squadrons of French cavalry escorting various staffs, commandeered farm horses with shaggy fetlocks fastened in rope corrals, artillery rumbling along rutted roads which shook the gunners almost off their limbers. Nothing was changed, and everything. There was no René to smile his adoring smile, but Marie came out, sobbing and laughing, and threw herself into the girl's arms. The little house was the same, save for a hole in the kitchen wall. There were the great piles of white bowls and the shining kettles. There was the corner of her room, patched by René's hands, now so long quiet. A few more shell holes in the street, many more little crosses in the field near the poplar trees, more Allied aeroplanes in the air. That was all that was changed. But to Sara Lee everything was changed, for all that. The little house was grave and still, like a house of the dead. Once it had echoed to young laughter, had resounded to the noise and excitement of Henri's every entrance. Even when he was not there, it was as though it but waited for him to stir it into life, and small echoes of his gaiety had seemed to cling to its old walls. Sara Lee stood on the doorstep and looked within. She had come back. Here she would work and wait, and if in the goodness of Providence he should come back, here he would find her, all the empty months gone and forgotten. If he did not, "I shall still be calling you and waiting," he had written. She too would call and wait, and if not here, then surely in the fullness of time which is eternity, the call would be answered. In October Sara Lee took charge again of the little house. Mrs. Cameron went back to England, but not until the Traverses' plan had been revealed. They would support the little house, as a memorial to the son who had died. It was, Mrs. Travers wrote, the finest tribute they could offer to his memory, that night after night tired and ill and wounded men might find sanctuary, even for a little time, under her care. Luxuries began to come across the channel, food and dressings and tobacco, knitted things, too, for another winter was coming, and already the frost lay white on the fields in the mornings. The little house took on a new air of prosperity. There were days when it seemed almost swaggering with opulence. It had need of everything, however. With the prospect of a second winter, when an advance was impossible, the Germans took to hammering again. Bombardment was incessant. The little village was again under suspicion, and there came days of terror when it seemed as though even the fallen masonry must be reduced to powder. The church went entirely. By December Sara Lee had ceased to take refuge during the bombardments. The fatalism of the front had got her. She would die or live according to the great plan, and nothing could change that. She did not greatly care which, except for her work, and even that she felt could be carried on by another as well. There was no news of Henri, but once the king's equerry, going by, had stopped to see her and had told her the story. "He was ill, undoubtedly," he said. "Even when he went to London he was ill, and not responsible. The king understands that. He was a brave boy, mademoiselle." But the last element of hope seemed to go with that verification of his illness. He was delirious, and he had gone in that condition into the filthy, chill waters of the inundation. Well and sane there had been a chance, but plunging wild-eyed and reckless into that hell across, there was none. She did her best in the evenings to be cheerful, to take the place, in her small and serious fashion, of Henri's old gaiety. But the soldiers whispered among themselves that mademoiselle was in grief, as they were, for the blithe young soldier who was gone. What hope Sara Lee had died almost entirely early in December. On the evening of a day when a steady rain had turned the roads into slimy pitfalls, and the ditches into canals, there came, brought in by a Belgian corporal, the man that swore that Henri had passed him in his trench while the others slept, and shoved him aside, which was unlike his usual courtesy, and had climbed out over the top. To Sara Lee this Hutin told his story. A short man with a red beard and a kindly smile that revealed teeth almost destroyed from neglect, he was at first diffident in the extreme. "It was the captain, mademoiselle," he asserted. "I know him well. He has often gone on his errands from very near my post. He smiled, "I am usually in the front line." "What did he do?" "He had no cap, mademoiselle. I thought that was odd. And as you know, he does not wear his own uniform on such occasions. But he wore his own uniform, so that at first I did not know what he intended." "Later on," she asked, "did you hear anything?" "The usual sniping, mademoiselle. Nothing more." "He went through the inundation." "How else could he go? Through the wire first, at the barrier, where there is an opening, if one knows the way. I saw him beyond it, by the light of a fusee. There is a road there, or what was once a road. He stood there. Then the lights went out." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. On a wild night in January, Sara Lee inaugurated a new branch of service. There had been a delay in sending up to the front the men who had been on rest, and an incessant bombardment held the troops prisoners in their trenches. A field kitchen had been destroyed. The men were hungry, disheartened, wet through. They needed her, she felt. Even the little she could do would help. All the day she had made soup, and at evening Marie led from its dilapidated stable the little horse that Henri had once brought up, trundling its cart behind it. The boiler of the cart was scoured, a fire lighted in the firebox. Marie, a country girl, harnessed the shaggy little animal, but with tears of terror. "You will be killed, mademoiselle," she protested, weeping. "But I have gone before. Don't you remember the man whose wife was English, and how I wrote a letter for him before he died?" "What will become of the house if you are killed?" "Dear Marie," said Sara Lee, "that is all arranged for. You will send a Poperinghe for your aunt, and she will come until Mrs. Cameron or some one else can come from England, and you will stay on. Will you promise that?" Marie promised in a loud wail. "Of course I shall come back," said Sara Lee, stirring her soup preparatory to pouring it out. "I shall be very careful." "You will not come back, mademoiselle. You do not care to live, and to such—" "Those are the ones who live on," said Sara Lee gravely, and poured out her soup. She went quite alone. There was a great deal of noise, but no shells fell near her. She led the little horse by its head, and its presence gave her comfort. It had a sense that she had not, too, for it kept her on the road. In those still early days the Belgian trenches were quite accessible from the rear. There were no long tunnel ways to traverse to reach them. One went along through the darkness until the sound of men's voices, the glare of charcoal in the busket bored with holes, the flicker of a match, told of the buried army almost underfoot or huddled in its flimsy shelters behind the railway embankment. Beyond the lines a sentry stopped her, hailing her sharply. "Qui vive?" "It is I," she called through the rain. I've brought some chocolate and some soup." He lowered his bayonet. "Pass, mademoiselle." She went on, the rumbling of her little cart deadened by the Belgian guns. Through the near by trenches that night went the word that near the repose of the angels, which was but a hole in the ground and scarcely reposeful, there was to be had hot soup and chocolate and cigarettes. A dozen or so at a time, the men were allowed to come. Officers brought their great capes to keep the girl dry. Boards appeared as if by magic for her to stand on. The rain and the bombardment had both ceased, and a full moon made the lagoon across the embankment into a silver lake. When the last soup had been dipped from the tall boiler, when the final drops of chocolate had oozed from the faucet, Sara Lee turned and went back to the little house again. But before she went she stood a moment, staring across toward that land of the shadow on the other side, where Henri had gone and had not returned. Once, when the King had decorated her, she had wished that, wherever Uncle James might be, on the other side, he could see what was happening. And now she wondered if Henri could know that she had come back, and was again looking after his men while she waited for that reunion he had so firmly believed in. Then she led the little horse back along the road. At the poplar trees she turned and looked behind, toward the trenches. The grove was but a skeleton now, a strange and jagged thing of twisted branches, as though it had died in agony. She stood there while the pony nuzzled her gently. If she called, would he come? But, then, all of life was one call now, for her. She went on slowly. After that it was not unusual for her to go to the trenches on such nights as no men could come to the little house. Always she was joyously welcomed, and always on her way back she turned to send from the poplar trees that inarticulate aching call that she had come somehow to believe in. January, wet and raw, went by. February, colder with snow, was half over. The men had ceased to watch for Henri over the parapet, and his brave deeds had become fireside tales, to be told at home, if ever there were to be homes again for them. Then one night Henri came back. Came as he had gone, out of the shadows that had swallowed him up. Came without so much as the sound of a sniper's rifle to herald him. A strange, thin Henri, close to starvation, dripping water over everything from a German uniform, and very close indeed to death before he called out. There was wild excitement indeed. Bearded private soldiers, forgetting that name and rank of his which must not be told, patted his thin shoulders. Officers who had lived through such horrors as also may not be told, crowded about him and shook hands with him and with each other. It was as though from the graveyard back in the fields had come, alive and smiling, some dearly beloved friend. He would have told the story, but he was wet and weary. "That can wait," they said, and led him, a motley band of officers and men intermixed, for once forgetting all decorum, toward the village. They overtook the lines of men who had left the trenches and were moving with their slow and weary gait up the road. The news spread through the column. There were muffled cheers. Figures stepped out of the darkness with hands out. Henri clasped as many as he could. When with his escort he had passed the men they fell, almost without orders, into columns of 4 and swung in behind him. There was no band, but from 1,000 throats, yet cautiously until they passed the poplar trees, there gradually swelled and grew a marching song. Behind Henri a strange guard of honor, muddy, tired, torn, even wounded, they marched and sang, "Trou la la, ça ne va guère, trou la la, ça ne va pas." Sara Lee, listening for that first shuffle of many feet that sounded so like the wind in the trees, or water over the pebbles of a brook, paused in her work and lifted her head. The rhythm of marching feet came through the wooden shutters. The very building seemed to vibrate with it, and there was a growing sound with it that soon she knew to be the deep voices of singing men. She went to the door and stood there, looking down the street. Behind her was the warm glow of the lamp, all the snug invitation of the little house. A group of soldiers had paused in front of the doorway, and from them one emerged, tall, white, infinitely weary, and looked up at her with unbelieving eyes. After all, there are no words for such meetings. Henri took her hand, still with that sense of unreality, and bent over it. Sara Lee touched his head as he stooped, because she had called for so long, and only now he had come. "So you have come back?" she said in what she hoped was a composed tone, because a great many people were listening. He raised his head then and looked at her. "It is you who have come back, mademoiselle." There was gaiety in the little house that night. Every candle was lighted. They were stuck in rows on mantel shelves. They blazed and melted into strange arcs above the kitchen stove. There were cigarettes for everybody, and food, and a dry uniform, rather small, for Henri. Marie wept over her soup, and ran every few moments to the door to see if he was still there. She had kissed him on both cheeks when he came in, and showed signs, every now and then, of doing it again. Sara Lee did her bandaging as usual, but with shining eyes. And soon after Henri's arrival a dispatch rider set off post haste with certain papers and maps, hurriedly written and drawn. Henri had not only returned, he had brought back information of great value to all the Allied armies. So Sara Lee bandaged, and in the little room across the way, where no longer Harvey's photograph sat on the mantel, Henri told his story to the officers, of his imprisonment in the German prison at Crefeld, of his finding Jean there, weeks later when he was convalescing from typhoid, of their escape and long wandering, of Jean's getting into Holland whence he would return by way of England, of his own business, of what he had done behind the lines after Jean had gone. He said nothing, but his listeners knew and understood. But his dispatches off, his story briefly told, Henri wandered out among the men again. He was very happy. He had never thought to be so happy. He felt the touch on his sleeves of hard, brown, not over-clean hands, infinitely tender and caressing, and over there, as though she had never gone, was Sara Lee, slightly flushed and very radiant. And as though he also had never gone away, Henri pushed in the salle à manger and stood before her smiling. "You bandage well, mademoiselle," he said gaily. "But I bandage better. See now, a turn here and it is done. Does it hurt, Paul?" The man in the dressing chair squirmed and grinned sheepishly. "The iodine," he explained. "It is painful." "Then I shall ask you a question and you will forget the iodine. Why is a dead German like the tail of a pig?" Paul failed. The room failed. Even Colonel Lilius confessed himself at fault. "Because it is the end of a swine," explained Henri, and looked about him triumphantly. A gust of laughter spread through the room and even to the kitchen. A door banged. Henri upset a chair. There was noise again, and gaiety in the little house of mercy, and much happiness. And here I think we may leave them all, Henri and Sara Lee, and Jean of the one eye and the faithful heart, and Marie with her kettles, and even René, who still in some strange way belonged to the little house, as though it were something too precious to abandon. The amazing interlude had become the play itself. Never again for Sara Lee would the lights go up in front, and Henri with his adoring eyes and open arms fade into the shadows. The drama of the war plays on. The great playwright sees fit, now and then, to take away some well-beloved players. New faces appear and disappear. The music is the thunder of many guns. Henri still plays his big part, and Sara Lee her little one. Yet who shall say, in the end, which one has done the better? There are new and ever new standards, but love remains the chief. And love is Sara Lee's one quality. Love of her kind, of tired men and weary. The love that shall one day knit this broken world together. And love of one man. On weary nights, when Henri is again lost in the shadows, Sara Lee, her work done, the men gone, sits in her little house of mercy and waits. The stars on clear evenings shine down on the roofless buildings, on the rubbish that was once the mill, on the ruined poplar trees, and on the small acre of peace where tiny crosses mark the long sleep of weary soldiers. And sometimes, though she knows it now by heart, she reads aloud that letter of Henri's to her. It comforts her. It is a promise. "If that is to be, then think of me, somewhere, perhaps with René by my side, since he too loved you. And I shall be calling you, and waiting. Perhaps, even beyond the stars, they have need of a little house of mercy. And God knows, wherever I am, I shall have need of you." End of chapter 30, and end of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart.